I've taken the problem of humanizing algorithmic listening as literally as I could, which has encouraged me to be kind of speculative for this talk because I think it's an impossible problem. I think that machine listening is quite a sort of faulty, leaky metaphor for what we do as humans when we listen. But I think that's encouraging rather than discouraging. It's going to make us try and think about what we can do to change how we think about machine listening. So I'm a musician and a kind of music sociologist, I guess. So my insights are skewed towards the methodology of studying music as a living practice. And the kinds of questions I've occupied myself with, well, my practice is using autonomous tools to make music, basically. And the question I'm thinking about at the moment is, how do we write music sociology when we have tools which make music without me necessarily playing them like I would a violin? And I've got three kind of points or three kind of ruptures I want to open up in thinking about how we might humanize algorithmic listening. And they come from quite a broad spectrum of positions. So the particular hill I've chosen to die on is holding a position which Owen kind of, I think, quite elegantly described in a previous conference as being a reformulated humanist. Do you remember that?
Yeah, unreconstructed, I thought.
Unreconstructed or whatever it was. And I'm trying to give my own specific twist on this position to kind of build up Owen's beef with computational approaches, but expanding that much further in both cognition and sociology. Two fields where machinic metaphors of intentional human behavior interact with and feed back into our theorizations of what it means to be human. By this, I'm referring to as what I treat as one of the foundational operating assumptions of my work, that of the performativity of method, which put simply states how the material and discursive are intricately intertwined, which, as John Law puts it, that in surprising and contradictory ways, our methods seem to create the worlds which they purport to describe. My implication here is that a description of a complex black box or set of black boxes as performing some creative or intentional behavior in everyday practice is never simply a description, and it's worth examining the precise mechanisms through which any given set of algorithms comes to stand for intentional human behaviors like improvising, composing, or even listening. As for some time now, objects which exhibit some form of autonomous intentional behavior have played an increasingly large role in the public consciousness, and it's those devices which deftly operate in the cultural sectors, performing those most quintessentially human activities, from playing games to writing fiction, which are the most attention-grabbing of all. And this public-facing aspect of cultural automatons is worth careful consideration on two consecutive fronts, I think. Firstly, in how it shapes the public discourse around the nature of autonomous objects, how we construct popular ideas of what it is these objects do, independent of specialist knowledge and detailed technical descriptions. And secondly, how this material discursive covenant reflects the broader dynamics of science arts and the increasing role the arts play in mediating publicly funded scientific research to the general public. As computational techniques don't just offer opportunities for new knowledge, rather they construct our very ideas of what academic knowledge is, something which I think has been readily apparent from the talks this morning. And this is something which Gary Hall has pointed out, and that there's a danger that the computational turn is kind of being collapsed into the entire description of what the digital humanities are. And in a short essay, Beyond the Digital Humanities Beyond Computing, is really excellent in questioning quite how much the humanities need to draw from computational methods to define itself, and that perhaps computer science is not all that well equipped to understand itself and its own founding object, the computer, let alone help the humanities with their relation to computing and the digital. As it seems, the traffic between the humanities and computing has been very unidirectional, and it's worth investigating what a digital humanities might look like that can extend beyond the disciplinary objects, working assumptions, and methodologies of computer science. So I'm going to leave those kind of disciplinary anxieties about our methodology just kind of hanging and move on to my sort of three questions around the usefulness of the metaphor of machine listening, and to suggest that kind of crucially, What gets left behind through computational approaches is how meaning is attached to or conveyed by music and sound more broadly. So my first point, I'm going to skip over a load of kind of theoretical background and point to my friend and colleague Juan Loaiza's exhaustive and comprehensive work tying together the inactive approach to cognition and new musicology. To quickly summarize, the inactive approach is broadly defined in opposition to computational, Cartesian dualist conceptions of the mind, where embodiment needs to be articulated with other core concepts such as organismic autonomy, sense-making, emergence, experience, and the self-organization of multi-agent interactions that give form to social life. And the important point to take away from new musicology for the purpose of this talk is to say that meaning is conveyed by and attached to music through its articulation in social life. That content alone cannot bear the explanatory weight for how any given collection of sounds becomes meaningful, but rather meaning arises through the rich interactions of traditions, emotions, codes, rituals, practices, and sounds across multiple timescales. Music is best understood by understanding the relationships it creates, the various entanglements of humans and objects around sounds. And what I'm trying to allude to briefly here is the deep asymmetries between the processes of human and machine listening. That human listening is irreducible to the sound, ear, and brain, and that by simply adding complexity to the functional, representational models of machine listening only serves to deepen those asymmetries. So this is my first kind of suggestion for how we might humanize algorithmic listening, is to make it multi-scale, and that context is not simply just like a cherry on top that can add some flavor to the content which is in itself meaningful, but content is always mediated in a complex feedback loop with its environment. And like ideally we would get rid of that dichotomy entirely, that context, I'm using context to kind of speak as the world out there and music is the thing which is in here. But these two things are inseparable. And to reduce it to either one, you lose kind of the human. My second point is that very broadly speaking, there's been two approaches to technology in the philosophy of technology. First is instrumental, treating technologies as tools which we manipulate towards some ends. The second approach, which someone mentioned, Stiegler just now, is originary technicity, which treats technologies as that which is directly constitutive of what it means to be human, that technologies construct and change our cognitive apparatus. But it seems that often there's a temporal trajectory to how we conceive our relationships with technologies. With new technologies, more often than not, it seems that the questions surrounding them are instrumental in nature, like what can we do with this new thing? Like how can it help me? What does it do? Rather than thinking about how they constitute what we think of as knowledge. It's only after the fact, when these kind of wild innovations find some stability, that technologies become opaque. And these are when the questions of originating technicity kind of get floated. I've got way too much stuff. I think this is, okay, my second point then of how to humanize algorithmic listening is to make it reflexive, to question how it constructs our concepts of our own behaviors, and to resist fixed implementations, to keep things messy, open, and fragile, forefront the fragility of machine listening algorithms. They're such like weird floppy things that are so unpredictable and often require really precise conditions to make viable. Forefront the fragility and forefront the conditions that make them possible in the first place. Resist implementation. Artists are already doing this, like David Kamp's work and Owen's kind of stuff is really good examples of that. So change our attitude. Instead of thinking of the strange behaviors as anomalous, think of them as the default state of machine listening. Default states which can then become, and often do become, reified to identify patterns and kind of prove points which have already been made. My third point, I guess I don't really have much time for.
You've got 40 seconds, go on.
Third point is about group-making practices and categorization, kind of follows on from the second one. I was going to draw from Actor Network. You're making me not talk about Latour here. So everyone will be thankful, yeah. So the third point is about group-making practices are always steeped in controversy. When we're out in the world, one of the first things we kind of notice is that we're being pulled in so many different directions to be put in different groups. You already kind of made this point. All I'm saying is make machine listening algorithms argue about if a track is deep house or something or not. keep our categories controversial and fluid and changing. And I'll leave it at that.
Brilliant, bang on time.